Martin Tankleff was only 17 when he came home and he found his mother murdered and his father clinging to life. So he immediately called 911. The police show up, and instead of consoling him because his family has been murdered, they immediately rush him off to police headquarters and begin to use harsh interrogation techniques to have him try to admit to a crime he never committed. During this period of time, they began to tell him things like, hey, we've already found your skin under your mother's fingernails. Oh, and your dad woke up and he told us you were the attacker. It would be better for you if you just admitted to what happened. At no time was he ever Mirandized, and during this entire time, he maintained his innocence. But over a period of time, the police continued to question him and begin to make him believe that he must have done something wrong. And after a period of time, after being told that his father said he did it, he finally confessed to it, and under the pretense that the investigators made him believe he must have blacked out and committed a crime that he never remembered committing. Now, you want to know the tragedy of all this? As a result of this false confession, poor Martin ended up getting a 50-year prison sentence. And it wasn't until after he completed 18 years of that sentence, in 2007, his conviction was overturned and he was released. Now, why do I bring this up? Because that is a tragedy. And I want to talk to you today about false confessions. And many times people will bring it up. They'll say, hey, listen, do false confessions really matter? I mean, they don't really happen all that often anyway. Well, the reality of it is police-induced false confessions are among the leading causes of wrongful convictions in criminal defense. In fact, since the late 1980s, 6 studies have documented approximately 250 interrogation-induced false confessions. More than 2/3 of DNA-cleared homicide cases documented by the Innocence Project were caused by false confessions. So in this video, I want to explore what is a false confession? How do they happen? Why do they happen? And what can be done about it in terms of a criminal defense in a trial? Now, one of the first things we want to do is let's talk about 3 types of false confessions. Let's jump right into this. So number 1, we're going to look at voluntary false confessions. Number 2, we're going to look at coerced-compliant false confessions. And then number 3, coerced-internalized false confessions. So number 1, a voluntary false confession occurs when someone confesses to a crime they didn't commit without any coercion from law enforcement. Now, this is a strange one, but I'm going to give you some real-life examples of this. This can happen for a variety of reasons, such as a desire for attention or to cover up or an effort to please law enforcement. One of the best examples of this is the case of Richard Jewell. If you remember back in 1996, there was the Centennial Olympic Park bombing that took place, and at that time, a bomb exploded in Centennial Park and resulted in 2 fatalities and numerous injuries. Richard Jewell at the time was a security guard working at the park, and he had discovered the actual suspicious backpack that was located there and immediately alerted authorities at the time, helping to evacuate the area, and he actually played a pretty big role in helping at the time. However, due to a miscommunication and a profiling effort at the time of this incident, Jewell was mistakenly identified as a suspect in the bombing. Now, law enforcement subjected him to intense media scrutiny and relentless questioning, focusing on him as a possible perpetrator, and under the pressure and media attention, Richard Jewell was questioned, and ultimately he voluntarily confessed to having planted the bomb, which was all an enormous lie. In fact, it was believed that he may have the false confession in order to protect his reputation and the intense scrutiny that he was being placed under at the time. Now, why do I say this is because, listen, this sort of situation comes up. You have to highlight the fact just because someone confesses to a crime does not in any way whatsoever mean they actually committed the crime. And actually, I think it was Clint Eastwood that did and directed a movie about Richard Jewell and the tragedy of his life. You should check it out. It's a pretty good movie. The reality of it is it highlights the fact that Richard Jewell, he wasn't all there when it comes to what was going on at the time and he was taken advantage of. He actually ended up voluntarily confessing to something he did not do. So that's number 1, a voluntary false confession. What about number 2? A coerced compliant false confession. This occurs when someone confesses to a crime they didn't commit in order to escape an uncomfortable or stressful situation during an interrogation, such as when they're exhausted or hungry or sleep deprived. You see this happen much more frequently. One of the best examples of this was the Central Park 5 case. This took place back in 1989 and it involved the wrongful conviction of teenagers for the rape and assault of a female jogger in New York Central Park. This case, created a big media firestorm at the time, and it also exposed a number of problems within the criminal justice system regarding false confessions. In fact, if you go back to it and you study this case, it's very interesting. There were 5 teenagers at the time, and they were all between the ages of 14 and 16 at the time of the incident. What happened was this. They ended up being grabbed by the police. They were interrogated by the police about this incident, and they had no parents involved. There was no legal counsel involved at the time of this interrogation, and each of these boys ended up eventually confessing to the crime. Now, the issue of false confessions shows how serious this is, that you can isolate boys like this and get them together, particularly when they're 14 to 17 years of age, and they can begin to confess the things because they break, because of the way that the actual interrogator treats them during the questioning. So the teenagers reported that they were subjected to intense and prolonged interrogations, manipulative tactics, and psychological pressures from law enforcement during that period of time. It also included a bunch of false promises. There were false promises of leniency and threats and lies about evidence that supposedly existed against them. And psychological research has shown that individuals, especially young people, are the most vulnerable to these situations and those that have mental health conditions as a result of that. Now, what ended up happening was in 2002, now think about this, in 2002, Matthias Reyes, a convicted serial rapist and murderer, came forward and confessed to being the one that attacked the jogger, the female jogger. And in fact, DNA evidence later confirmed that Reyes was the sole perpetrator of the crime at the time, and the confessions of the Central Park 5 were all false. Every one of it. It was false confessions all the way around. Now, the reality of it is, and in 2002, after spending several years in prison, these poor boys who had falsely confessed to a crime they did not commit whatsoever, they finally had their convictions vacated by the courts. But it doesn't mean that they didn't suffer irreparable harm as a result of not only going to prison, but having this stain on their criminal record at the time. So that's number 2. Number 3, just moving quickly here. Number 3 is coerced-internalized false confessions. Now let's talk about this one a little bit. This occurs when someone comes to believe that they actually committed the crime that they falsely admitted to. So here they actually get to a point where they begin to believe what the investigator's telling them, that maybe I did commit the crime, even though they didn't. One of the best examples of this is what is known as the Norfolk 4. In 1997, in Norfolk, Virginia, a young woman named Michelle Morse Bosco was raped and murdered in her apartment. And as a result of that, the investigation led to the arrest of 4 U.S. Navy soldiers, or sailors at the time. But here's the problem. During the interrogation process of this case, the Norfolk 4 were subjected to intense and prolonged questioning by the police. And after several hours, without the presence of legal counsel, you learn that the detectives began to use very coercive tactics on them and made promises of leniency, which they never planned on following through with, in exchange for their confessions. That's what happened in the case. So they ended up under the relentless pressure and fear of severe consequences as a result of this. All 4 men eventually confessed to the crime with the Norfolk 4. And so what ended up happening is the DNA evidence later proved that none of them were involved in it. Literally, none of them were involved in the rape. And that the real perpetrators ended up being a man by the name of Omar Ballard, who acted alone in the crime. And that DNA evidence cleared these men of actually committing the crime. So why is that important? Because the reality of it is it's a tragic example of the dangers of false confessions. Now, I want to get into this. We already talked a little bit about why. Why did these happen? Well, there are a number of reasons why this can take place. Let me give you some examples. 22% of false confessions come from those who have mental disabilities or mental challenges. And then another 10% of false confessions come from those who have diagnosed mental illnesses. Why does that matter? That means they become easy targets. In addition to that, a large number of false confessions come from those who were younger, particularly teenagers, those who are easily I would say mendable and malleable in the hands of the police. In addition to that, once somebody begins to confess to something or believe something the police tell them, they'll confess to almost anything. And that's one of the things that psychologists have learned as a result of this. And so what are the consequences of false confessions? Well, look, it should seem obvious, but the consequences are enormously severe. You can not only talk about a wrongful conviction, you can talk about wrongful imprisonment, and of course, the most obvious of consequences, there are consequences that involved trying to get a job. And even if you were innocent and you're cleared, this stuff was out there. People can read about who you are, and it's very difficult to get past the stigma of what somebody else has already claimed that you've done. 35% of the 317 cases exonerated by DNA received no compensation. So many times people who have done nothing wrong, that poor kid who's sitting in jail for 18 years got very minimal compensation as a result of his release. In fact, one of the things that we look at is 20% of the 1,281 exonerees related to the Innocence Project and those that were exonerated ended up involving a false confession as a contributing factor. Studies have proven that false confessors, even in cases involving confessions later proven to be false, juries many times believe it. 73 to 81% of the cases they had found them guilty in a jury trial. So, why do we talk about this? I want to bring this up because how do you address these issues of false confessions in criminal defense trials? How are they addressed? Well, look, one of the things that a criminal defense strategy, you can absolutely argue that there's a false confession. But you know one of the most difficult challenges for using this defense as a criminal defense attorney? According to a report by Northwestern University School of Law, after speaking with hundreds of police jurisdictions, the research found that virtually every officer with whom they spoke to having given custodial recordings a try was enthusiastically in favor of the practice of using deceptive practices on subjects. And so what happens is 68% indicated they believed a suspect would confess falsely not very often or almost never. What happens is this study ended up verifying the fact that most people believe this perception that the vast majority, think about this, most jurors believe that no one would ever confess to something they didn't do. And it's a gross misunderstanding of the fact how confessions work. Listen, unless you are either in there as a defense attorney and you watch how people are being manipulated by the police, or unless you yourself have been under this type of scrutiny and manipulation by the police, you don't quite appreciate the fact that many people can absolutely confess to something they did not do. So defense number one, that the confession was coerced. Let's talk about that. The current federal legal standards for determining of whether a confession was involuntary and obtained by coercion is essentially one of the things we look at as courts, both state and federal courts, look under what the standard known as the totality of the circumstances to evaluate the voluntariness of a confession. This means that they consider the overall circumstances during the confession, including the characteristics of the defendant. You know, we can talk about that, his age, his mental capacities, the conditions of the interrogation at the time it took place, the tactics that were used by law enforcement. And the primary constitutional protection relevant to this issue is the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, and this guarantees the right against self-incrimination. The Supreme Court has held that confessions obtained through coercion or involuntary in nature cannot be used against you in your trial. So, how do we look into? What are some of the facts we look at? Is it voluntary or is it not? Here's number one, police misconduct. If the police in any way used physical or psychological coercion, threats, promises, or other improper tactics during the interrogation, it could be ruled as being involuntary, particularly this one. Now listen, I want you to understand the police can lie to you. They can 100% lie to you. But what they can't do is promise you to do something in exchange for you saying something. So, hey man, listen, if you'll just tell me what happened here, tell me this, tell me you did it, and I'll let you go. Tell me you did it and I won't charge you. They cannot do that. They can't make those kind of promises to you as coercion. Number two, the defendant's characteristics. What is the age of the person, their mental capacity, their physical condition of the defendants are taken into account. And one of the examples there is confessions from juveniles or individuals with those intellectual disabilities should receive special scrutiny compared to others. And then number three, the length and the intensity of that interrogation. If the questioning was excessively lengthy or relentless or conducted under harsh conditions and those sort of situations, there you could have a confession that was coerced as a result of that. And it's really important to understand that. That needs to be looked into. Number four, were you read your rights? Now, this is a big one. look, if you were in custody and you were not free to leave, I don't care how relentless the police were, you could say whatever you want, but under the Miranda warnings that are under Miranda versus Arizona, it's really important to understand if you are not free to leave and they are interrogating you, they cannot use your statements against you in court unless you voluntarily waived your rights and then you agreed to speak. And then even then we have to take a look at the voluntariness of the waiving of your rights. Did you sign a form? How is it presented to you? All of those things must be scrutinized. Finally, we talked about this for a moment, but promises or inducements, that's a no-go. It's really important. The police cannot come and promise you leniency, reduced charges, benefits in exchange for a confession. All of that can cast doubt on the voluntariness of the confession. Now, I want to read this to you because I thought this was really good. Under the article, True Crimes, False Confessions, there's this really good confession expert by the name of Professor Saul Casson of Williams College. He says this, there's a 9-step process that's devised by the textbook's author here. After isolating the suspect, here's what the interrogator does. Listen to the steps that are taken by an experienced police interrogator. Here's what they do. Number 1, they confront the suspect with unwavering assertions of guilt. In other words, we already know you did it. And I mean, they're beyond convinced, and they say they have plenty of evidence to prove it. Number 2, they develop themes that psychologically justify or excuse the crime. Hey, man, we already know you did it, but we know you had a good reason. And it's okay. We can tell you, look, I don't blame you. I can understand why you might have done it. Number 3, it interrupts all efforts at denial and defense. They shut down any opportunity for you to say no or to defend it in any way. Number 4, overcomes the suspect's factual, moral, and emotional objections. Just gets right down to it, saying how somehow that it may have been a moral thing to do. Number 5, it ensures that the passive suspect does not withdraw. Number 6, shows sympathy and understanding and urges them to cooperate with him. He sympathizes with them and begins to make them feel like they're your friend, and he knows you had a reason to do what you did. And then it offers a face-saving alternative construal of the alleged guilty act. In other words, they'll almost paint a picture of 2 ways it could have happened. One that was really bad, like you're a bad person, and the other one's like, any reasonable person would have done this one. Which one did you do? Instead of giving them a chance to say, I didn't do anything, they only give them those 2 options to choose between as a result of that. And then finally, it gets the suspect to recount details of his or her crime. And in fact, you got to be very careful with this one, because sometimes they'll try to have a suspect recount details of a crime that they never knew about, but they will plant the seeds of what could have happened in the mind of that individual and make it seem like they knew things they didn't know. I mean, there's really deep psychological damage being done here in these type of interrogations. So essentially what happens is these sort of things take place. They destroy the suspect's confidence that he will emerge from that interrogation without being harmed. And to make the suspect think that it's basically he's powerless to bring an end to it all. The only way he can get out of this interrogation is if he confesses to it. So literally they bring that suspect to the brink of hopelessness, to the point they feel like they have no other choice but to give in to exactly what's being said. So when we talk about this and we understand what's going on, it's critical to realize those are some of the exact tactics that are used here. So, and I mentioned this earlier, but juveniles are perhaps the most vulnerable to these techniques. I mean, think about that poor boy I talked about, 17 years of age, spent 18 years of his life. I mean, listen, I've got kids and it just brings me to tears and to see that. And as a criminal defense attorney, to understand why you have to have a criminal defense attorney looking into these matters so heavily when someone's relying primarily only on a confession. Okay, so also mentally handicapped people with lower IQs are obviously going to be more susceptible to these techniques as well. So finally, defense number 2, we know this already, and I've kind of gone over this, but your attorney needs to be looking very heavily at, did the actual Miranda rights, were they read to the individual? Were they asked to make sure that they understood them? And did they affirmatively waive those rights? And what are the Miranda rights? We know what they are. The right to remain silent. You always have a right as an arrestee to remain silent and not answer any questions posed by law enforcement. Number 2 is the right to an attorney. You always have the right to an attorney to be present during any questioning. And of course, if you cannot afford one, the state must provide you one. And then that warning that anything that you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, and you must be informed of these statements, and you must affirmatively waive those statements in order for something like this to be used against you. Now, listen, I could go through so many of these examples here. I mean, many of you know about the Netflix documentary, The Making a Murderer, which was Brendan Dassey. He did that as well. Another false confession. Over and over again, the more aggressive you end up finding police acting, and you look for these very heavily in homicide cases involving violence, the police are relentless. They must find their guy at all costs, even if it's the wrong guy. These are the type of issues that you must look into very clearly. So why do I bring this up? Because when this issue comes up, I know it's not something that applies to every case, but I can tell you right now, when you see those type of statistics and you understand the number of people that could be on death row right now based upon a false confession, and it's just shocking to me why these courts would not agree to allow DNA evidence to be tested or to be used in order to exonerate folks, and why you end up having like the Innocence Project and other attorneys having to push so hard to even give someone an opportunity to be exonerated. But please understand, false confessions happened. And maybe you or a loved one has been faced with a situation like this. And I want to encourage you, listen, if you're in the North Texas area and you need someone to help you in your criminal case, we provide free consultations at the Hampton Law Firm. But I just wanted to go over this with you because it's really important. This is not an area that people talk enough about. And I just saw a case like this up at the courthouse recently where there was an argument made by the defense that there was a false confession that was taking place. And what was amazing to me is the number of jurors sitting in that jury box that looked over and just kind of was like, whatever. Are you kidding me? Someone gave a false confession. The general public needs to understand false confessions are very serious and they happen all the time. And I want to encourage you, comment in the section below. If you know any information about this, you want to share your comment, or maybe there's something you can add to the discussion, I'd be happy to respond to that. But I want you to know, if you need any help in the North Texas area, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll see you on our next video series.